In the summer of 1900, two prospectors hiking along the east edge of the Kennecott Glacier looked up at a mountainside in the Wrangell Range and saw what they believed was a high alpine meadow, a brilliant patch of green thousands of feet above the valley floor, the kind of place you might drive horses to graze. They climbed toward it. What Clarence Warner and a man known as Tarantula Jack Smith found when they reached those cliffs was not grass. It was copper. Exposed, oxidized copper ore, malachite, staining the rock face green for hundreds of feet. They chipped off samples and had them assayed. The results came back at 70% pure chalcocite. To put that in perspective, most copper mines in the world operate profitably on ore that is 1 or 2% copper. These men were standing on a mountainside that was, in effect, already refined. Jack Smith would later describe it to a young mining engineer in Valdez. "Mr. Birch, I've got a mountain of copper up there. There's so much of the stuff sticking out of the ground that it looks like a green sheep pasture in Ireland when the sun is shining at its best." On July 4th, 1900, Warner and Smith filed their claim. They called it the Bonanza. They had no idea what they'd set in motion. Within 15 years, two of the most powerful financial dynasties in American history would pour the equivalent of $700 million modern dollars into the Alaskan wilderness before shipping a single pound of copper. They would build a 14-story wooden mill at the foot of a glacier, blast tunnels through frozen mountains, and lay a railroad across terrain so hostile that the engineers tasked with building it nicknamed their own project Can't Run and Never Will. When it was all finished, the mine would produce more than 1 billion pounds of copper and earn its investors over $200 million, the equivalent of roughly $4 billion today. And then, on a cold day in November 1938, the last train would pull out, and every person in town would leave. They would leave the machinery in the mill. They would leave the furniture in the houses. They would leave the X-ray machine in the hospital. The company that bore the mine's name would go on to become the largest copper producer in the United States. The town itself would become a ghost. This is the story of Kennecott, Alaska, and to understand how it happened, how all of it happened, the fortune and the abandonment, you have to start not in Alaska but in New Jersey, with a 10-year-old boy whose father had just died. Stephen Birch was born in Brooklyn in 1872, the second of 6 children. His father, a Union Army sergeant, died when Stephen was 10. 3 years later, his mother moved the family to Mahwah, New Jersey, to be near relatives. The Birch children were poor. By some local accounts, young Stephen came to school without lunch, and his classmates fed him from their own boxes. But in Mahwah, the Birches had a piece of luck that would eventually reshape the economy of Alaska. Their next-door neighbors were the Havemeyers. Theodore Havemeyer was vice president of the American Sugar Refining Company, one of the wealthiest families in the Northeast. His wife, Lily, took a particular interest in Stephen. She paid for his education, first at Trinity School, then at New York University, and finally at the Columbia School of Mines, where he earned his engineering degree in 1898. That same year, the Klondike Gold Rush was pulling thousands of men north. Birch could have stayed in New York and worked on the subway system, then being built beneath Manhattan. Instead, with money from Mrs. Havemeyer, he booked passage to Valdez, Alaska. He was 26 years old, a trained mining engineer, arriving in a territory that had no roads, no railroads, and almost no maps of its interior. He attached himself to a U.S. Army expedition led by Captain William Abercrombie, surveying the Copper River District. He saw the country, he met the prospectors, and he listened. When Warner and Smith came back to Valdez in the fall of 1900 with their copper samples, Birch was there. He knew immediately what 70% ore meant. Most men in his position would have tried to scrape together enough money to buy a claim or two. Birch did something different. He went back to New York and started working his connections, the same connections that had put him through school. By 1902, financed by H.O. Havemeyer, the son of the woman who had fed and educated him, Birch began buying up the Bonanza claims. He consolidated 21 separate claims into a single entity, the Alaska Copper and Coal Company. He was 30 years old, and he now controlled the richest copper deposit on Earth. The consolidation was not easy. The original prospectors had filed multiple overlapping claims. A rival group, the Chitina Exploration Company, claimed to have grub-staked Warner and Smith and insisted they were owed a share. Lawsuits flew back and forth from 1901 to 1904, a tangle of frontier law disputes fought in territorial courts by men who had staked their futures on a patch of green rock 200 miles from the nearest lawyer's office. Birch fought them all, won most of them, and by the time the dust settled, his Alaska Copper and Coal Company held clear title. But control was one thing, extraction was another. The Bonanza ore body sat at 6,000 feet in mountains laced with glaciers, 200 miles from the nearest deep-water port. There were no roads. The only way to move copper in quantity was by rail, and every engineer who looked at the proposed route said it couldn't be done. The Copper River Valley was a gauntlet of canyons, rapids, shifting sandbars, and hurricane-force winds. Two enormous glaciers, Miles and Childs, calved icebergs into the river from opposite banks at a narrow pinch point, leaving barely enough room for a bridge. The terrain between the coast and the mine included frozen bogs, avalanche chutes, and temperatures that dropped to 60 below zero in winter. Without a railroad, the richest copper deposit in the world was worth nothing. Birch needed money, far more than the Havemeyers could provide. In March 1906, he walked into the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company in New York. 2 months later, he sat down with Daniel Guggenheim, whose family had already merged with the American Smelting and Refining Company to dominate the lead and silver business in the United States. The Guggenheims knew mining. Morgan knew capital. And Birch, the fatherless boy from Brooklyn, educated on sugar money, had the ore. In June 1906, the three parties formed the Alaska Syndicate with the specific goal of building a railroad, operating the mine, and shipping the copper to a Guggenheim-owned smelter in Tacoma, Washington. Birch was named one of 3 managing directors. He was 34. The money the syndicate committed was staggering. Between 1905 and 1911, they would spend roughly $25 million, the equivalent of more than $700 million today, before a single pound of copper left Alaska. They bought a steamship company. They bought a right-of-way. They hired the best railroad builder alive, Michael James Haney, a Canadian-born Irishman known as Big Mike, who had already accomplished one supposedly impossible feat, building the White Pass and Yukon Railroad out of Skagway into the Klondike gold fields. If anyone could lay rails through the Copper River Valley, it was Haney. The choice of route was itself a battle. Rival investors had promoted railroads starting from Valdez or from Catala, a small port to the east. The syndicate initially tried building from Catala, but a catastrophic winter storm in 1907 destroyed their facilities there. Engine house, support base, everything. They pivoted to Cordova, a deep-water harbor on Orca Inlet that Haney himself had identified and named on March 13, 1906. It was the right call. But the syndicate's growing control over Alaskan land, shipping, mining, and transportation drew fierce opposition. They bought up hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness. Critics began calling Alaska first a colony of Russia, then a colony of Guggenmorgen. Judge James Wickersham, Alaska's territorial delegate to Congress, led a sustained campaign against what he saw as monopolism run amok. The political pressure would eventually force the syndicate to reorganize into a publicly traded corporation, but that was still years away. Construction began from Cordova in 1907. The challenges were immediate and relentless. The first winter storm destroyed the engine house and the entire support base. Haney rebuilt. Workers laid track across saltwater flats, through narrow canyons above whitewater rapids, and along mountainsides so steep that men had to be roped to the rock face while they drilled. The Kuskulana River Canyon alone required a bridge suspended 238 feet above the water. 3 steel spans crossing a chasm barely 200 feet wide. It was built in the dead of winter, at temperatures routinely 40 to 60 degrees below zero, with winds screaming through the gorge. It was finished on New Year's Day, 1911. But the real test of the railroad was the $1 million bridge. The Copper River, at the point where the glaciers faced each other, was a nightmare of physics. Water levels fluctuated by 24 feet. Icebergs jutting 20 feet above the waterline drifted through the channel. Wind speeds exceeded 90 miles an hour. The chief engineer, E.C. Hawkins, designed a 1,550-foot steel bridge with 4 massive truss spans set on concrete piers sunk deep into the riverbed, each pier fitted with steel icebreakers to deflect the flows. Construction began in the spring of 1909. Skeptics predicted the spring ice breakup would destroy the falsework before the bridge could be completed. They were nearly right. In May 1910, Hawkins recorded in his diary that the ice had pushed the falsework under the 3rd span 15 inches out of position. It had to be put back. He wrote 2 sentences about it and moved on. The bridge was completed by June 1910 at a cost of $1,424,775. It held. Michael Heaney did not live to see it. In August 1909, on his way back to Alaska after a meeting with Guggenheim in New York, the steamship he was on struck an uncharted rock and sank. Heaney survived the wreck, but his health was already failing. He had been suffering from pulmonary tuberculosis. He made it back to Cordova, oversaw the final push of the railroad to the Tikal River, and then went to Seattle for the winter. He died there on October 4th, 1910, 6 months before the first trainload of copper left Kennecott. He was 45. The man who built 2 of Alaska's most improbable railroads never saw either one fully operational. The last spike in the Copper River and Northwestern Railway, a copper spike, was driven in March 1911 by Hawkins and Superintendent Samuel Murchison at the end of the line in Kennecott. On April 8, 1911, the first ore train rolled out of the mountains. 32 railroad cars carrying $250,000 worth of copper, roughly $7 million in today's money, bound for the docks at Cordova and then by steamship to the smelter in Tacoma. The $25 million bet had finally begun to pay. And pay it did. By 1916, Kennecott's peak year, the mines produced over 100 million pounds of copper worth nearly $32.5 million. That year, Kennecott was the 3rd largest copper producer in the United States. The timing was not coincidence. World War I had created an insatiable demand for copper, for electrical wiring, ammunition casings, shell fuses, and communications cable. Copper prices, which had hovered around 13 to 15 cents a pound before the war, shot past 30 cents. Every pound that came down the mountain was worth more than twice what it had been worth 5 years earlier. Kennecott was producing roughly 10% of all domestic copper output, and the nation was producing more than half the world's supply. The green mountainside that 2 prospectors had mistaken for grass was now, in a very literal sense, fueling the Allied war effort. From 1915 to 1922, Kennecott ranked 3rd to 7th in production among all copper mines in the nation, alongside the legendary operations at Butte, Montana, Bisbee, Arizona, and Bingham Canyon, Utah. And Kennecott's significance was never really about volume. It was about quality. Despite the general assumption that Alaska's gold was its preeminent mineral resource, no Alaskan placer gold district or gold lode entity was ever as productive in raw dollar value as the Kennecott copper deposit. The ore was simply that good. While other mines were investing in vast flotation circuits and chemical processing to squeeze marginal percentages of copper from low-grade porphyry deposits, Kennecott was pulling 60% ore out of the mountain and stuffing it into burlap bags. The town that grew around the mill was a company town in the fullest sense. Kennecott Copper Corporation owned every building, every road, every utility. The settlement was only half a mile long and a few hundred feet wide, wedged between the glacier moraine and the base of Bonanza Ridge. At its center stood the concentration mill, a 14-story wooden structure painted the dark red of iron oxide, stacked against the mountainside like some improbable industrial cathedral. It was, and remains, the largest wood frame building in Alaska. Tramways ran from the 5 mines, Bonanza, Jumbo, Mother Lode, Erie, and Glacier, down to the top of the mill, carrying up to 1,200 tons of ore a day. Gravity did most of the work. The ore entered at the top and descended through a sequence of jaw crushers, jigs, shaker tables, and screens, each stage reducing it further, separating the dense copper from the lighter waste rock. High-grade ore, the astonishing 60 to 70% stuff, was simply crushed, packed into burlap sacks, and loaded onto rail cars at the bottom. It was so rich, it needed no further processing. But even the waste at Kennecott held more copper than most mines' best ore. In 1916, a chemist named E.T. Stannard, who would later become CEO of the Kennecott Corporation, designed the world's first commercial ammonia leaching plant, built right next to the mill. The process used ammonia to dissolve copper from the coarser tailings while leaving the limestone host rock intact. The ammonia was then evaporated, leaving behind copper oxide at 75% purity, which was sacked and shipped alongside the high-grade ore. In 1923, a flotation plant was added to capture even finer particles, ore less than 2 millimeters in diameter. By the time both processes were running, Kennecott was extracting somewhere around 95 to 98% of all the copper in the rock it mined. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was left behind. The mines themselves were extraordinary working environments. The Bonanza and Jumbo mines sat at over 6,000 feet on Bonanza Ridge, nearly 4,000 feet above the mill town, and connected to it by aerial tramways spanning 3 miles of open air. In winter, miners climbed to the mine portals through tunnels blasted into the mountain, working underground by candlelight and later by electric lamp, chipping copper ore with pickaxes from veins so rich that the rock itself gleamed blue-black with chalcocite. The cold was relentless. Even inside the tunnels, temperatures hovered near freezing year-round, and outside, exposure could be fatal within hours during a blizzard. Accidents claimed lives. The cemetery, a quarter-mile south of the mill town, contains 50 grave markers, each one a record of someone who came to Kennecott and never left. Avalanches, cave-ins, equipment failures, and the simple grinding toll of hard labor in thin air took their price year after year. Approximately 600 men worked at Kennecott at its peak, about 300 in the mill town, and another 200 to 300 in the mines above. The company attracted workers with salaries higher than any mine in the lower 48 offered. Men came from Scandinavia, Italy, Ireland, from mining towns across the American West, willing to endure 7-day work weeks, brutal winters, and almost total isolation in exchange for wages they could send home to their families. The company housed them in bunkhouses and family cottages, fed them in a mess hall, and provided amenities that were remarkable for rural Alaska in the early 20th century. A hospital staffed with doctors and nurses, which housed Alaska's first X-ray machine. A general store, a 2-room school with 2 teachers covering 8 grades, a recreation hall where dances were held every 2 weeks, a dairy that provided fresh milk, a tennis court, and a skating rink. There was even a movie house. 3 cottages were built on what residents called Silk Stocking Row, reserved for senior managers and their families. The dances, held once every 2 weeks in the recreation hall, did not observe social hierarchy. Miners, mill workers, and staff all danced with the few women available. The nurses, the teachers, a secretary or 2, the handful of wives who had followed their husbands into the mountains. A dentist came once a month. Episcopal missionaries who held the contract for religious services came on a similar schedule. In summer, the men played baseball. In winter, they skated on the rink or sledded down the hillsides. The mosquitoes were so ferocious that the tennis court required mosquito netting. 4th of July and Christmas celebrations in McCarthy marked the only real holidays. But the company also maintained firm control. No alcohol was allowed in Kennecott, no gambling, no brothels. This was a business operation, not a frontier town. So the frontier town grew up 5 miles down the road. McCarthy was everything Kennecott forbade. Founded on land originally claimed by a man named James McCarthy, it sprang up as the social release valve for a community of men working 7 days a week in conditions of extreme cold and danger. Saloons, restaurants, hotels, pool halls, a red light district along the creek bank, McCarthy had them all. At its peak, it served about 800 people. 2 newspapers operated simultaneously. There was a dress shop, a photography shop, a shoe shop, a garage and auto repair shop, a hardware store. The railroad engineers, it was said, devised a special whistle to alert McCarthy's saloon owners when a U.S. Marshal was on the train, giving them time to hide the more conspicuous evidence of vice. Whether that's true or apocryphal, it tells you everything about the relationship between the 2 towns. Kennecott made the money, McCarthy spent it. A word about the name. The mine, the corporation, and the town are all spelled Kennecott with an E. The glacier and the river from which the name derives are spelled Kennecott with an I, after Robert Kennecott, a naturalist who explored Alaska in the 1860s. A clerical error on some early paperwork changed the I to an E, and no one ever changed it back. So all the natural features carry the original spelling, and all the man-made features carry the mistake. It is a small thing, but it is also the kind of detail that tells you something about how hastily this entire enterprise was assembled, and how little anyone involved expected it to last. On April 12, 1915, the Kennecott Copper Corporation was formally established as a publicly traded company, organized by the Guggenheim and Morgan interests, with Stephen Birch as president. The restructuring consolidated the Alaska Syndicate's holdings, the mines, the railroad, the steamship line, under a single corporate umbrella. But Birch was already looking beyond Alaska. The phenomenal profits from the Wrangell Mountains provided the capital to fund something far larger, Kennecott's purchase of the Utah Copper Company and the Bingham Canyon Mine outside Salt Lake City, as well as the Braden Copper Company and other low-grade mines in Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Chile. The Alaska mine was the seed. The corporation it spawned would become an empire. But empires need diversified assets, and Birch understood, even in 1915, while the war was making Alaska copper more valuable than it had ever been, that the Bonanza deposit, however rich, was finite. In 1925, a Kennecott geologist confirmed what Birch had probably already suspected. The end of the high-grade ore bodies was in sight. The 1920s brought a brief reprieve. A government-mandated copper price of 23.5 cents a pound kept the operation running. But the miners could no longer count on finding ore at 60 or 70%. The best of it was gone. What remained was still high grade by global standards, but the cost of extracting it from an increasingly remote and difficult mountain, shipping it by tram, processing it through the mill, loading it on a railroad that ran through glacier country, and steaming it to Tacoma, was merciless arithmetic. When the margins got thin, Kennecott had nowhere to cut. You can't reduce the distance between a mountaintop and the sea. The decade that followed was a study in slow contraction. The glacier mine closed in 1929. The ore grades declined. The Depression crushed copper prices from their wartime peak of 35 cents a pound down to 4 cents by 1931. At 4 cents, it cost more to mine and ship the ore than the copper was worth. In October 1932, when a Copper River and Northwestern Railway bridge washed out, the corporation didn't bother to fix it immediately. They shut the mines down and waited. A small crew stayed on to maintain the underground workings, the plants, and the equipment. For 1933 and 1934, Kennecott, Alaska, sat silent. The mines reopened in 1935 on a reduced scale after the National Recovery Administration allowed copper prices to rise to 9 cents a pound. But the recovery was brief. The Supreme Court struck down the NRA as unconstitutional. Copper prices dropped again, and by 1936, the company's own annual report acknowledged what everyone already knew. Operations would cease within 2 years due to the inability to find new ore bodies. The Mother Lode mine closed at the end of July 1938. The final three, Erie, Jumbo, and Bonanza, closed that September. The closure was orderly. The man who organized it was Tappan Stannard, E.T. Stannard's son, carrying forward the family's connection to the place his father's ammonia leaching invention had helped make profitable. Employees received termination pay. On the last working day, everyone was served a turkey dinner. And then, on November 10th, 1938, some accounts say the 11th, the last train left Kennecott for Cordova, carrying the final residents out of the mountains and down through the canyons, across the Cusculana Bridge and the $1 Million Bridge to the port where steamships waited. 27 years. In 27 years of operation, minus the 2.5 years of Depression-era shutdown, the Kennecott mines had produced 4.625 million tons of ore, averaging 13% copper. That ore yielded 1.183 billion pounds of copper and roughly 9 million ounces of silver. Gross revenues exceeded $200 million. Net profit topped $100 million. These numbers were reported in an era when $100 million was an almost incomprehensible fortune, enough to build a major corporation, which is exactly what it did. What makes Kennecott's story distinct from other mining towns is not the rise or even the fall. Plenty of American towns have risen on a resource and fallen when it ran out. What makes Kennecott different is what happened and what didn't happen after the last train left. The town was not dismantled. The machinery was not removed. The 14-story mill was left standing with its jaw crushers and jig tables and ore bins and sackers still in place. The ammonia leaching tanks were left in the leaching plant, still stained with the iridescent residue of dissolved copper. The hospital was left with its equipment. The bunkhouses were left with beds. The power plant's 4 black smokestacks continued to stand against the sky, connected to nothing, generating nothing, marking the place where the lifeblood of the operation had once been made. No one came back to salvage, at least not in any organized way. For decades, the buildings just sat there, deteriorating slowly in the Wrangell mountain winters. 60 below zero, snowfall measured in feet, the glacier grinding away at the moraine just downhill. It was as if the corporation had decided that once the copper was gone, nothing else in Kennecott was worth the cost of removal. And perhaps nothing was. The buildings were wood frame, built for function, not permanence. The railroad existed solely to carry copper. Once there was no copper, there was no reason for the railroad. And without the railroad, there was no way in or out of Kennecott except on foot or by bush plane. The town had been designed as a system: mine, mill, railroad, port. And when one element failed, the entire system became useless. The green on the mountainside was gone. Everything built to serve it was now surplus. Meanwhile, the corporation bearing its name was thriving. By the 1930s, while the Alaska deposit was being exhausted, Kennecott Copper had expanded to become the nation's largest copper company. The Bingham Canyon mine in Utah, purchased with Alaska profits, would go on to produce more than 12 million tons of copper over its operating history, dwarfing what Alaska ever yielded. Kennecott acquired interests in Chile, in Nevada, in Arizona. Stephen Birch resigned as president in 1933 and was succeeded by E.T. Stannard, but Birch stayed on as chairman of the board, still directing strategy, still expanding. When Birch died in 1940, 2 years after the Alaska mines closed, Kennecott held nearly 15% of the world's known copper resources. He was buried in Hartsdale, New York, at a mausoleum with a stained glass window depicting Alaskan mountain scenery. The Havemeyer estate in Mahwah, the mansion belonging to the family that had fed and educated him, He had purchased it himself years earlier. The hungry boy from Brooklyn ended up owning the house next door. In 1941, the Kennecott Corporation donated the railroad right-of-way to the United States government for use as a public highway. It was a final, practical gesture. The corporation had no further use for a railroad to a mine that was empty. The old rail bed would eventually become the McCarthy Road, and the $1 million bridge would be converted to carry vehicles until the 1964 Good Friday earthquake damaged one of its spans, dropping it partially off its pier, and the road beyond was effectively severed. Today, the bridge still stands, repaired at a cost of $16 million federal dollars and reopened in 2005, though the Copper River Highway beyond it remains closed at mile 36 due to a failed bridge further on. The railroad that cost $25 million to build now carries nothing at all. For 40 years after closure, Kennecott sat largely untouched, visited only by the occasional bush pilot, adventurer, or squatter. McCarthy never quite died. A handful of hardy souls stayed on through the decades, living in the old buildings, keeping the name alive in a place that most maps no longer bothered to label. In the 1960s, Kennecott Copper Corporation sold its Alaska land, structures, and surface mining rights to the Consolidated Wrangell Mining Company. In 1976, the Great Kennecott Land Company was formed, and the town and surrounding acreage were subdivided and put up for private sale. A group of Anchorage doctors and lawyers bought parcels. For a while, it looked as if Kennecott might be carved up piecemeal, its buildings left to whoever wanted to haul a piece of history away. Two things saved it. In 1980, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act created the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve, 13.2 million acres, the largest national park in the United States. And Kennecott sat in the middle of it. In 1986, the mining town was designated a National Historic Landmark, recognizing it as the best preserved example of early 20th century copper mining in the world. And in June 1998, with the help of the Conservation Fund, the National Park Service acquired the most significant buildings and lands. The purchase was facilitated by Brad Micklejohn, and it ensured that the mill, the leaching plant, the power plant, and the core structures of the town would be stabilized and preserved, not restored to working condition, but held in what the Park Service calls a state of arrested decay. Structural repairs only as necessary to keep the buildings from collapsing. No new paint, no rebuilt interiors. The idea is to preserve the feeling of a place that was walked away from. Today, visitors drive 7 to 8 hours from Anchorage, the last 60 miles on the McCarthy Road, a narrow gravel track that follows the old railroad bed, crossing the Kuskulana Bridge, which is now a one-lane vehicle crossing still suspended 238 feet above the gorge. A sign at the start of the road reads like a warning label: "Bring enough food, no services until McCarthy, watch for railroad spikes, expect rough roads." At the end of the road, you park and walk or take a shuttle the final mile into McCarthy, which today has a year-round population of about 24 people. Ma Johnson's Hotel still stands, converted into a lodge. The Golden Saloon serves food. A small museum houses photographs from the mining days. From McCarthy, a shuttle runs 5 miles up the road to Kennecott, where the Park Service operates a visitor center in what was once the general store. St. Elias Alpine Guides leads tours inside the mill building and the ammonia leaching plant, the only way to enter those structures, walking visitors through rooms where the machinery still stands as it was left in 1938. The ammonia tanks sit silently rusting, stained in iridescent greens and blues from decades of leaked copper and ammonia, catching whatever filtered sunlight comes through the high windows. Outside, the 4 black smokestacks of the power plant still rise above the town. The red mill building, 14 stories of wood frame against the white expanse of the glacier, is the photograph that everyone takes. McCarthy's year-round population swells modestly in summer with seasonal workers and Park Service staff. But Kennecott itself has no permanent residents. It is a place people visit, not a place people live. The nearest grocery store is hours away by car. The winter temperatures still drop below 50 degrees below zero. The glacier still grinds against the moraine. What happened at Kennecott is, in one sense, the simplest story in American economic history. A resource was found, extracted, and exhausted. Capital moved in, took what was valuable, and moved on. The profits built a corporation that still exists. Kennecott became a subsidiary of the Standard Oil Company of Ohio in 1981, then passed through a series of acquisitions until it became part of Rio Tinto, the Anglo-Australian mining giant that today operates the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah under the Kennecott name. The copper that came out of the Wrangell Mountains wired American cities, cased American artillery shells, and generated the capital that consolidated an industry. The town that produced it all was a means, not an end. But the story is also stranger than that. Because unlike most abandoned mining towns which rot into the ground or get bulldozed for redevelopment, Kennecott was abandoned so completely, in a place so remote, that it was effectively preserved by neglect. No one tore the buildings down because no one could get to them easily enough to bother. No one stripped the machinery because it would have cost more to haul it out than it was worth. The glacier, the cold, the isolation, the very things that made Kennecott so expensive to operate are the things that kept it standing after everyone left. 600 men once worked in this town, 7 days a week, in conditions that would be unthinkable now. They mined copper with pickaxes in tunnels bored into frozen limestone at 6,000 feet. They packed 60% ore into burlap sacks and sent it down a tramway to a 14-story mill built on a glacier moraine. They earned wages higher than miners anywhere in the lower 48. And they spent those wages 5 miles down the road in a town of saloons and brothels that existed solely because the company wouldn't allow a drink within its borders. Their copper went to war, went to wire, went to the infrastructure of a nation electrifying itself for the first time. And when the mountain had nothing left to give, they ate turkey, boarded a train, and disappeared. Somewhere in the Wrangell Mountains, high on Bonanza Ridge, there is still a rock face where the limestone meets the greenstone. The green is fainter now. The richest outcroppings were mined away decades ago, but traces remain. The geological contact zone that Oscar Rohn first described in 1899, that Warner and Smith mistook for pasture land in 1900, that Stephen Birch leveraged into a corporate empire, it's still there, exposed to the weather, slowly oxidizing in the rain. The mountain doesn't know the copper is gone. It just keeps turning green.